Okay, so then we can start. So let's see if I can do half a decent job on the general announcement and code of conduct. Let me share my screen. Share. And do you all see my screen now? And can you all hear me? Keeping in mind that I will not have visibility on the chat, but I have session Paul's, Keith Bechtel, and Andres Plazas that will let me know if anything goes wrong. Welcome to the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion session. Really, we like to call it Justice, Diversity. It's a roadmap to a just, equitable, and diverse and inclusive Rubin Observatory that we organized. This is the last day, so I think the announcements can be kept to the minimum, but always remember that as you signed up for this meeting, you signed up to stand by a code of conduct and behave by it. The code of conduct can be found at the resources page. It's the first link on the drop-down menu. In general terms, it just establishes rules so we can treat each other respectfully and thoughtfully. And if you see anybody breaking the code of conduct, you can reach out to the ombudspersons, Rumpal Jill, and I don't remember who the other ombudsperson is. Andy Connolly, I think, to report and find support and ways in which issues can be addressed. We will use the chat and the Slack for this session as all the other sessions for you to ask questions and interact with us. And you can also give thumbs up to the questions on Slack so that they get more attention and are more likely to be answered. But most of the interaction in this session will happen in breakout sessions where the moderator of the breakout session will let you know about what are the chosen means of communications. Remember that this event is recorded. The plenary session, the general session is recorded, but as you will see in a second, the breakout sessions will not be recorded to preserve the anonymity in those environments. If you don't want your image to appear or your voice to be heard, of course, you're absolutely welcome to turn off the camera and turn off the microphone and interact only with the chat. I think that's all the announcements that were owed for the general meeting. So now we get into session-specific announcements, and the first thing that I want to do is acknowledge the support of many people that we had in organizing this session. I want to explicitly acknowledge Amira McBride and Adam Foley that consulted with us for the content of the session, and the LSSD Corporation that enabled these consultations through its support. Amira McBride is the Chief Officer for Diversity at ORA, and Adam Foley is from the Office of Equity and Inclusion at the University of Delaware. We want to thank Melissa Graham for chairing the SOC and entrusting us with organizing this session, and generally the entire SOC for being supportive of this session and organize it so that it is not a plenary, but it's not conflicting with, it doesn't have any other parallels running at this time, so that there are no conflicts and tensions in participation. And we want to thank explicitly Rumpel Jill and Melissa Brown for above and beyond organizational support for the session and for the meeting, and always thinking about how to make the meeting more inclusive. Dara Norman and Susan Kobe share insight into the history of the EI efforts at Rubin. We want to thank Dr. Brian Nord for setting the stage with a profoundly inspiring keynote address yesterday, and also the numerous resources that we use. Some of them are listed here. A lot of the material that we share with you and encourage you to use to prepare for the session comes from the TMAP report, and as well as material that was originally created by Dr. Brian Nord, Dr. Chandra Pasca, and many others. And there are links in these slides to some of this material. So the session will work out as follows. This is the overview of the session. We'll set goals and we'll describe the format of the breakout. Most of the session will actually happen, the activity of the session will actually happen in breakout sessions. The breakout sessions are organized by sphere of influence, and we ask you to sign up in advance for a sphere of influence, which is basically the direct affinity group that you think you can, where you think you can be most impactful in enacting change. The breakout sessions, spheres of influence and links are on the Rubin Meeting DEI session webpage, which should appear as a link on the chat and on Slack right now through my colleagues. And we want to emphasize that the breakout sessions are designed to have an open discussion, and for that reason, they are not recorded, and only people in your sphere of influence will participate. We will come back for a full group discussion where we will have some time, hopefully, for individual reflections and also to talk about the next steps in the process. So if you had time to look through the resources that we shared, or even if you didn't, I will describe now, the idea that what we want to do is achieve a process that is long-lasting and impactful to improve diversity, equity, and inclusion in Rubin and more generally in the society that we impact directly, for example, in physics and astronomy. And to do that, you need to engage into a very deliberate process to enact the change in a way that is long-lasting and impactful. And that process begins with sharing a collective vision around the proposed long-term goal. So Keith, myself, and Andres set forth set this vision around the shared goal. The shared goal that we verbalize is to maximize the number of students who self-identify as Black or African American that pursue research degrees involving Rubin Observatory data during the tenure of the survey operation. This is a proposed shared vision, and we realize that it has some pitfalls. For example, it's not entirely extendable to all the cultures. It's a little bit US-centric, and I will unpack in a second why this is our starting point. However, we encourage you to give feedback on this shared vision, and we encourage us all together to modify until it really suits its purpose through communication that can begin right now with the suggestion form that we have shared or directly on this chat and Slack. Once we have a shared vision and a proposed long-term goal, we engage in the process of, first of all, acknowledging that the change that we need is what we call second-order change following the theory of change and the TMAP report. This means that we're not going to directly just focus on acting upon our vision and goal, but we're going to try to investigate what are the preconditions that are necessary to achieve this goal in a way that proceeds from the goal backwards and affects all the areas of influence that are relevant. So we want to change, we want to propose the next level of thinking, both as a society, as a Rubin community, and also as an individual to think about how you're most impactful in enacting this change. As I was mentioning, the shared vision has some aspects that are culturally less transferable, perhaps. One of them is the fact that it focuses on anti-Black racism. I want to emphasize that the shared vision has to be specific enough to be able to be acted on. And that's why we restricted it to a specific point of action. And in that, we follow the TMAP report as well. Why anti-Black racism? Well, first of all, in the current times, we have seen unforgivable acts of violence specifically against the Black community and Black people. And so the US is going through a racial reckoning that follows them. We also want to move away from a utilitarian view of diversity, equity, and inclusion in an organization that would suggest that diversity, equity, and inclusion should be pursued because of an end goal that improves the organization throughput. Even though there is evidence, for example, that in the industry embracing DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion has a return, even a financial return. But we want to think about this as a social justice issue. We want to think about doing this because it is the right thing to do. We are explicit about anti-Black racism because we recognize that anti-Black racism is a specific and severe problem in physics. This is evidenced by the appalling number of Black and African Americans that participate in physics at the university at all levels, by the very slow growth in those numbers that is lower than for other minorities in the last few decades. And ultimately, we want to think that breaking barriers to inclusivity and particularly improving the climate, which is something that is much needed in physics in order for Black and African American students to flourish and achieve their potential, will also break barriers and improve the climate for other underrepresented and underserved populations and groups with a net gain for all. The way we want to engage into this thinking process requires us to set a premise. And the premise that we have set is that the status quo in the Rubin data right holders is by itself insufficient to provide equitable opportunities for participation in Rubin science. We think that the fact that the Rubin data is public within the US and Chile is a great opportunity for inclusivity, but by itself, it doesn't provide inclusivity. And the fact that it doesn't is witnessed by the overrepresentation of primarily white institutes and R1 university as it is right now in the project and science collaborations. So we want to design a process, and we really today want to focus on the process. The process is long, and today we can do nothing in 1 hour, if not begin to design it. And the process that relies on us setting the goal that I outlined earlier. So this brings me to why wasn't the goal more specific, so that it is more easily measurable and perhaps even achievable. We didn't set a specific number to the idea of maximizing the number of degrees pursued by Black and African American students on Rubin data, because by setting a number, we actually limit our thinking of what is possible. We want the goal to be specific, but we also want it to be plastic and adaptable and improvable so that we can make it more ambitious as we go through the process. So today we begin to interrogate the process of what is needed to achieve that and develop a methodology following the theory of change. Sometimes we think about this as a logic model. We want to identify what are necessary preconditions for the goal, intervention points, and benchmarks. And we will be more specific about this. And for that, I am passing the virtual microphone to Keith.
Okay, so next slide, please. Okay, so the main emphasis of this hour session is the breakout discussion. So again, these are organized by the self-selected spheres of influence. You should feel free to choose which is most appropriate. There's an overview of these on the next 2 slides. Each breakout room has already been assigned a moderator, and most of them have scribes. If you find yourself in a breakout room that doesn't have a scribe yet, then please someone can volunteer to take that role. And the idea is that each breakout room over the next 30 minutes will collectively develop responses to 2 prompts. And there's a shared Google Doc, which we will post the link to in just a moment. This is visible to all the spheres, and we hope that you take some inspiration potentially by looking at what the other spheres are doing. The next slide. This is just a reminder of the spheres of influence. So there are 8 of them. Again, we tried to create these spheres so that there would be opportunities we felt for everyone involved in the Rubin community to plug into where they felt most appropriate. So next slide. I won't speak to these in detail now, but these are available. Also, we have some ground rules for discussion. We won't walk through each of these now, but again, these are posted in that Google Doc, and so please feel free to reference these and to consider how we can have a respectful discussion with each other. Next slide. So what we're embarking on is the start of this theory of change process as a Rubin community. Ideally, we would all be doing this in person, right? We would all be together, and we would be able to create this more easily the sort of visual diagram of how all of these different outcomes and conditions are related to each other, starting from our long-term goal and working backwards. It's a little bit more challenging to do this in a virtual environment, but Federica and I last night, we sort of tried taking on an example ourselves just to see how this would play out virtually. And if you go to the next slide, we have an example of how this might look. So in this particular example, we start with some top level outcome that we want to achieve, and then we work back to the preconditions, thinking about what interventions we might add, to address, to make those preconditions possible. And then for each of those interventions, thinking about some indicator of, what change we're making, how are we measuring success. So we don't want people to get hung up too much on the exact details of the terminology or, exactly how to express this in the Google Doc. This example is in that document. So you're free to copy it and kind of work from this template. But if you feel that in your breakout session that the ideas are flowing rapidly and you're just trying to capture those ideas quickly, you shouldn't feel constrained to this model. But we provided it as a framework to help guide your thinking. So these are the two prompts that we wanted to give you for the breakout discussion. The first of these is really getting us to envision what the second order change looks like. What do we mean by changing the norms, the values, and the culture? We really want you to think intentionally on just what that means as an entire Rubin community, and to think about those preconditions. And then if there's time, you may be able to get to a second prompt, which is thinking more about this process of the interventions and the indicators. And we realize that 30 minutes is very short. And so if you end up spending the full 30 minutes on the first question, that's totally fine. So now is the time that we would ask you to go to the breakout Zoom channels. There are 8 channels. They are available on the web page for this session. So we'll see you in 30 minutes. We'll do a Slack broadcast to remind everyone at approximately 9:40 to, that there's a 5-minute warning to return to the Zoom room. So enjoy the discussions. Hope it's really productive. Are people seeing my share screen?
Yes.
Okay, so I'll drive and I'll let Federica start. Once have people joined?
Okay, so we have 92 people. I'm gonna start by making the remark that 30 minutes was not nearly enough at all to begin the process. So the session that I ended up in, we didn't get to preconditions, but we agreed to meet on Slack to talk about preconditions. We talked about maximizing, about the overall goal. So I guess as people are coming back in, I want to make sure that people are not discouraged by the fact that there was such little time. This was a thinking exercise to think about the process, and very much just the start of something that we hope will be sustainable and continue. 30 minutes was definitely not enough to do anything else. So we have 120 people. Should we tentatively? People are still coming in though at a very fast pace.
I think we're at 180 before the breakouts, so.
Wow, that was a lot.
So we could, I guess we could start to introduce the prompt and give people a chance to start thinking about it.
Mm-hmm.
Right, so we have one more thinking exercise. This is an exercise in individual reflection and introspection. And the exercise is to answer a question that you find in a form. I want to emphasize that the form is entirely anonymous. It does not collect any information about you. And this is because we want to encourage you to be absolutely honest about this prompt. And when we come back, we'll give you 4 minutes. Let's cut off 1 minute because we're a bit behind. We'll give you 4 minutes and we'll read one or two of the answers that have been submitted, picking them more or less at random. Have we posted the link to the form?
Yeah, let's post it now. I think Andres was going to do that.
On both the Slack channel and the chat, you should now see a link to a form. The form is, yes, the form is, the link is here now on the chat and on the Slack channel as well. And we'll reconvene in 3 or 4 minutes. Keith, do you want to start and read one of the responses? I think we have 6 minutes to the end of the session, so we just have to do that. We hope. I see the responses are still streaming in, but unfortunately, that's all the time that we have.
So I'll start by reading some responses to the. So it's a 2-part prompt. If you haven't had a chance to answer the second question, please go ahead and move on. I'll start by reading some responses to the first question. For example, mostly older white people feel that they can speak over others because they are, quote, more experienced. Another example, lack of concern that none of the project leadership is Black. Another, mostly in the society that feels that our academic bubble, pipeline questions, difficulty seeing past disadvantaged backgrounds when assessing students and other hires.
So I'm going to read one and I'm going to read both parts, but I'm going to read just a part of it. I don't think I've seen a single Black person speak at this meeting. And then the introspection part states that white women definitely benefit from affirmative action, even while facing issues with sexism. We will read all of each and every single one of these answers. We will, as Andres will speak in a second, have a wrap-up session, a meeting that we will organize in a couple of weeks to tell you what we saw in the Google Docs and in this form. And so this is how we will continue this, but we'll leave the form open for a bit longer throughout the break, so you can continue giving us answers. I'm gonna call on Andres to talk about the next steps.
Yes, thank you, Federica. So as Federica was saying, so the next step, the next immediate step is to have a summary by mid-September of this session. We will summarize and visualize the outcome of each breakout room and in the framework of the theory of change that we have linked, that we have talked about. And this will happen in a follow-up conference call. And I also wanted to call out that there's going to be another session related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And this is by the LSST Corporation, in which they want the input of the community in order to build in DEI efforts from the beginning of their new programs and the new research initiatives. So after the break, please consider joining this session to continue the conversation that we have had here. Next slide, please. Maybe the previous one, and briefly talk about the workshop that we're going to have. So in 1 year, we have been funded by the LSST Corporation to the LSST Corporation Enabling Science Grant to create to have an interactive anti-racism workshop during the next project and community workshop. And this is a workshop that will be facilitated by an organization that conducts training on overcoming institutional racism. And there is an emphasis in how to understand the racism as as an institutional problem of power that goes beyond personal prejudice. So there will be training facilitators. There will be multiple sessions of about 90 minutes in groups of different sizes, but there will be, these sessions will be led by 2 facilitators of the organization. And the idea is in between how we can sustain a conversation of what we have done here and what's going to happen in a year from now. So which also will link to what we're going to talk in September, right? This is something that we have to keep thinking about, how we tie everything together. So the final slide, I think we have 1 minute. And just to say, that we have been talking about organizational changes that require a sustained effort. Now we've been talking about what we call second order change, and this is something that takes a long time. As you have realized, 30 minutes was not nearly enough to start thinking about this, but it's a first step. So we want to encourage you to continue in the immediate framework. Maybe you're welcome to continue giving your opinion in the Slack channel and in the Google document in the breakout sessions. But also we want to think about how we can, all of us collectively, think about making progress in our sphere of influence, and in a form of that this is a shared leadership process. So yes, thank you very much. Federica, do you have anything else to say?
No, just to emphasize that the plan for next year's anti-racism workshop does give a lot more time than we had today for the DEI work, for the diversity, equity, and inclusion work. And I, for one, am very excited not to feel so rushed as we go through it. I hope to see you at the next diversity, equity, and inclusion session, understanding that it's a parallel session, so you may have conflicts, and at the summary of the breakout sessions later.
So just a final word. I think we learned in this process that 30 minutes is very, very, very short. And so I think that, Federica and I and Andres and others, I think we should think about if there's some sort of follow-up that we want to do. I think we should just be open-minded and continue that discussion.
And actually, let me point out that there is a great discussion going on the chat that was prompted by the answers to the questions that we have proposed. I'm not sure that I can save this chat because the chats cannot be copied and pasted. If one of the administrators can, perhaps the chat should be preserved. Otherwise, please let's continue this discussion on the DEI channel on Slack.
I think Chris Walters says he knows how to do that, so grab him.
Excellent. Thanks, everybody. This is your break. We don't want to cut too much into it.